Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe to my new channel. If you want something in particular, comment below, and I will oblige. Thanks again. Bentley Brooklands Buyer's Guide. They don't make M like the Brooklands anymore. The Brooklands was seen as the successor to the 1991 to 2003 Bentley Continental R Coupe, which at the time was the fastest, most powerful and, at a minimum price of £181,000, the most expensive Bentley ever. At £230,000 before options, the new Brooklands wasn't exactly bargain basement, but the development budget for it was. Its original raison d'etre was to keep Bentley's designers occupied after the Continental Arnage and Azure programs had been completed. 60% of the Brooklands came from the Azure. Not much more than the roof, rear skin, seats and underbody, and suspension tuning were truly new. What these two big beasts, the Continental R and the Brooklands, had in common was a beast of an engine, Rolls-Royce's legendary all-aluminium L-Series 6.7-litre V8. This was motoring's equivalent of the Spitfire's Merlin engine. It wasn't much younger than the legendary World War II fighter plane either, having first powered Rolls-Royce production cars back in 1959. Even in the 2008 Brooklands, the L didn't have the 4-valve overhead cam heads that had been standard on high-performance cars since the 1980s. Instead, its 2 valves per cylinder were activated by pulsating pushrods and rocker arms choreographed by a single central gear-driven camshaft. Somehow the LV8 continued until 2020, when the last of the 60-year run of 36,000 engines was smoothly slipped into a Mulsanne 6.75 edition by Mulliner. By that time the pushrod V8 was serving up a road-wrinkling 811 pounds, featuring power remained the same at 530 horsepower, an amount that might not seem spectacular today, but the hulking torque still raises a nervous giggle in 2023. The Brooklands fuel consumption and CO2 emissions figures 14.1 mpg combined and 465 grams per kilometer were, and still are, intimidating. Imagine how much juice it would be swigging at a steady 184 miles per hour, the car's eminently doable top speed. Naughty, but nice. That 6.75 Mulliner Mulsanne cost in the region of £350,000 new. Just 30 of them were built, and at the time of writing, we couldn't find any for sale in the UK. As noted earlier, the Gen 2 Brooklands was expensive too, but with a limit of 550 cars on the 3-year crew run, it was nowhere near as exclusive as the MM or, in 2023, as elusive, even though that 550 limit was never reached. Point being, a genuine used market in the Brooklands does exist. Don't expect to find one for the same sort of money as a 93 Brooklands though. Those old 4 doors start at under £20,000. A Brooklands coupe will cost you at least £110,000. It's a lot of money, but, well, just look at it. Is there any finer combination of power and elegance? This is the sort of automotive statement that will get hotel doormen scuttling to move lesser cars off the forecourt. You'd like to hope so, actually, because you might not fancy trying to squeeze one into a multi-story. Outside of the car park and on the open road, you may come to the conclusion that this is one of the best Bentleys of any age. Past or present. Engine. The red line was at 4,600 revolutions per minute and the Tacho didn't go beyond 5,000 revolutions per minute, but you were whooshing effortlessly past everything else on the road long before the needle had got anywhere near the 3,000 revolutions per minute mark. The very name of the main powertrain man at Bentley at the time, Brian Gush, gave you a clue about the character of the L for this engine. Revs were irrelevant. The additional beauty of an engine as old as the L series, a deep Y-shaped block design like the Merlin V12 with wet liners and a single gear-driven camshaft in the center for refinement, is that there's been plenty of time to understand its workings and foibles. It was a tough old boot right from the start. Back in the 1950s, the then -6.2-litre V8 was benchmarked against American 5.8s. In testing, the Detroit Iron was routinely run at maximum throttle for 4 days non-stop. The L was just warming up at that point. It ran on at watt for over 3 weeks. Twin-turbo L-series engines did have issues with head gaskets and camshaft tappet wear, but modified head studs and bolts and different head gaskets put that issue to bed in 2007, a year before the Brooklands arrived. By this time Bentley reckoned that, with no spark plug and height compression, the engine was strong enough to run on diesel without damage. Another story was put about that the new engine could idle on the exhaust emissions of the old one. That might be an urban myth, but then again it might not. For 2010, the weight of the crankshaft was reduced by 6 kilograms and the pistons and conrods by a total of nearly 2 kilograms, which was a lot for those components. As with the power output, 5.3 seconds for the 0 to 62 miles per hour and 0 to 100 miles per hour in 11.7 seconds might not sound that impressive nowadays, but it certainly was when it was being achieved in such an enormous piece of equipment and with that ZF gearbox that wasn't mega responsive. Context was everything. There were no gearshift paddles, which on first acquaintance seemed quite appropriate on a car this big, but the competence of the chassis suggested that they might have been a fun idea, especially as the action of the main selector lever in manual mode forward to change up, backward for down was counterintuitive. If you weren't mentally prepared to handle single-figure MPG numbers, you wouldn't want a Brooklands. Same with servicing. To accumulate a posh service history with certificates to say that your car had been prepared to exacting standards by Bentley certified technicians, you might want to stick with big-name operators like P. A case of Inquire or POA. What do they have to hide? Well, you can probably guess. A Brooklands auctioned in March 2021 for £82,500 came with paperwork for AP. But by old, they mean 8 to 10 years. A narrow window that excludes the Brooklands. You'd like to think they'd be happy to talk to you at least. Rybrig's fixed price service plans, £2,500 to include one service per year for the first 3 years, only apply to cars that are up to 3 years old. Even the traditionally cheaper independents are coy about their prices. Prasad's Automotive in Sydenham to publish some, from £703 for small service, from £915 for medium, and from £1,291 for large. But they don't say what any of those services entail, and the word from makes it all a bit open-ended. Still, at least they have had a go. Flying Bee in Nantwich, Cheshire, has a good reputation as an independent, with only ex-factory techs and specialist engineers working there. They offer fixed-price servicing, the costs of which they are happy to put on their website, but again it would be a case of talking to them about a Brooklands, as the newest one of those will be more than 10 years old and this model is not specifically mentioned on their site, although our Najas are. As a guide though, their annual 10K services start at £530 for year 1, and for each year after that they go £800, £530, £1,150, £530, £1,195, £530, £1,150, £530 and £1,650 in year 10. Besides servicing, they do wood and soft trim repairs as well as performance upgrades. Flying Spares in Leicestershire can usually help out with aftermarket parts if originals are hard or impossible to obtain from Bentley. Chassis. As noted earlier, the Brooklands was based on the drop-top Azure platform. As weight wasn't considered to be an issue, Bentley left all the Azure's strengthening girders where they were for the Brooklands. This, plus the steel roof, invested the Brooklands with mega body control for the weight, making it possible for the driver to tip it remarkably sharply into corners for the weight, and even earhole the car in safety. That was not something you'd particularly want to try in an Azure. Brooklands steering was light but not too light, and impressively precise. Sport mode didn't do a lot for the car's handling, but it did help the gearbox a bit. Carbon ceramic brake discs were a £14,000 option. The 420mm ones on the front wheels were the largest ever fitted to a production car and were claimed to give the Brooklands more stopping power than any other passenger vehicle on sale at the time. Most stopping power wasn't the same as shortest stopping distance, of course, not with over 2.5 tons to rein in. That might be something to consider if a Brooklands you were interested in buying was perfect in every way apart from having standard steel brakes and you thought that your driving style might involve frequent hard stops from high speed. With either setup you had more than half a chance of avoiding a Bavarian cattle truck as it pulled dozily out of the inside lane at 50 miles per hour while you were humming along at 180 miles per hour with Sibelius whispering in your ear, ideally through the £4,000 Naim stereo option, but with the carbon discs you could avoid 2 Bavarian cattle trucks in quick succession. That wasn't necessarily the case with the steels. 20 inches, disc, 16-hole wheels were standard Brooklands fitment, but many cars were ordered from new with the optional 5-spoke 20 inches alloys that were part of the Sports Combination Level 1 package. This also included dark tint stainless steel matrices in the bumper apertures. To that spec Level 2 added diamond quilted indented hide seat facings and door, 3/4 panels, indented hide for the steering wheel, headlining and quarter head cushions and embroidered mark emblems on all four headrests. Cars as heavy as these will inevitably go through suspension components at a fair rate, but there are no model-specific issues that we're aware of outside of normal wear and tear. Air suspension generically can have problems. If one end of the car is lower than the other, usually the front, you'll need to address this before the compressor dies expensively. It's not a bad idea to adjust the air suspension system every now and then as you're going along. Exercising it in this way will help to prevent premature seizing up of sensors. Valves and the like. Bodywork. There was no getting away from the fact that the Brooklands was a huge vehicle. It was getting on for 18 feet long, with a 10-foot wheelbase and a weight of over 2.6 tons, but if you saw a picture of one with no human being in view you'd have no clear idea about how massive it was. That was a tribute not just to Raul Perez and the other members of Dirk van Brakel's design team who did such a brilliant job of disguising the heft, but also to the crew craftsfolk whose coach building skills allowed the designers to incorporate things they might not otherwise have been able to. Like for example the floating rear screen whose lower edge sat well above the upper edge of the boot lid. That feature was only made possible because the time-served crew had the ability to flawlessly hand-weld the rear wings to the C-pillars. Talking of pillars, the Brooklands was a pillarless coupe, well, B-pillarless anyway, with one button on the center console to drop all four windows at once. This helped to create a lovely airy feel that was nicely in keeping with the Brooklands' claim to have the most spacious rear seating area in coupe history. The doors were so big they had two interior handles, the rearmost one being for backseat passengers to use. The exterior door handles were knurled to glitter in a suitably seductive manner, and there were some lovely paint colors available in the literally billions of color and trim combos, like grey violet or burnt oak. You could ask for the front grille to be chromed if you were a complete bounder. Interior. The inside of a Brooklands would have been familiar to Azure owners, but with a kind of extra magnificence conferred by the solid roof. The presence of a railed chassis gave the floor a high feel, but that fitted in with the general loftiness of the experience. Above you was a leather headlining. There was no sunroof option, you bought an Azure for that. Below you was sumptuous leathers. Around you were fabulous wood veneers and chunky controls in solid polished stainless steel rather than cheaper plated metals. You could spot the VW, Audi group piece, but, by and large, it was an authentic Bentley experience. Of the 600 hours it took to assemble each Brooklands, 125 of them were spent hand-stitching the 16 leather hides. If you couldn't care less about the impact on resale, you could have your name engraved on the door kicker plates for $1,000 or so. The front seats in a Bentley or Royce were never especially heavily bolstered because nobody expected you to hoon one around a tight bend. But the surprising competence of the Brooklands chassis did have some testers wishing for more side support. 99.9% of Brooklands owners weren't road testers though. The most troubling inner question for owners would be whether there could possibly be a more deliciously comfortable or affirming environment than this, and if so what. An infotainment screen rose up out of the dash top on pressing a button in the overhead panel. It wasn't a touchscreen, as they weren't really around then. It wasn't actually an infotainment screen either, as it only controlled the sat-nav and the rear camera feed if the first owner had paid extra for that. You operated the screen via a remote that sat in one of two leather pouches in the footwell. Rear passengers were not only no worse off than those in the front, they were arguably better off because they could see more of the exquisiteness laid out in front of them from their electrically adjustable heated seats. Even 6-foot pluses were not compromised on head or legroom in the back. The boot was generously sized and contained not one but two Bentley umbrellas. It was a genuine Grand Tourer for 4. You could get 400 miles and more out of the tank, but at April 23 prices it would cost you £150 to refuel. A Bentley branded CTEK trickle charger was supplied FOC. There was a Bentley branded Nokia car phone too, and a mechanical handbrake, but there were no cup holders. My thoughts. The Brooklands is a rare and special car. It's also a surprising one, belying its burliness by driving much more neatly than you might expect. It was no Euro thoroughbred, but it rarely lost its cool. It had the underlying character of an Arnage but with an extra sharpness that didn't impact negatively on the ride. Which was velvety, or on the feel at the steering wheel, which was informative. Bentley has admitted that it was mainly a back-office shoestring budget project designed to keep their staff busy between proper projects. Almost by accident, it turned into what many seasoned observers consider to be the best Volkswagen-era Bentley ever, and perhaps the best big coupe ever. Two of the press launch cars were immediately appropriated by VW Group head Martin Winterkorn and Bentley Motors head Franz Joseph Pagen. Which tells you something. It was bad luck that the Brooklands was launched in a time of major global economic turmoil, but cars like this are largely untroubled by global events. Anyone wealthy enough to buy such a creation new is usually going to be wealthy enough not to have to sell it. The economic uncertainty did prevent Bentley from selling the whole allocation of 550 cars, however. It's thought that 426 were sold, with 6 more prototype cars on top of that. 97 examples were supplied to the UK market, with 8 more cars supplied to other right-hand drive markets. The rarest ones are the late 10-plate cars, of which just 6 were registered. On top of this rarity, there's the sentiment. For many, the V8 was a perfect representation of the good old days. The new school, represented by coupes like the Rolls-Royce Wraith, not so much. Its engine was bigger, but despite its extra capacity, 4 extra cylinders and twin turbos, it had 160 pound-feet less torque than the Brooklands. The V8 in Brooklands spec really was the nuts. 3 years ago, when the old V8 was about to be decommissioned, you could pick a Brooklands up for under £100,000, but those days seem to be over as the smart ones have begun to realize just how special this car is. The most affordable example on PH Classifieds at the time of writing was this metallic anthracite 33,000 miler from 2008, the first year of manufacture, at a fiver under £110,000. Looking around elsewhere shows that £110,000 does seem to be the entry price point now. The front of this cheap one is honorably scarred from brisk sorties. But they and the lived-in driver's seat make it a car to enjoy rather than embalm.